Evening, wherever you are. My name is Arun Gupta. I am the Vice President and General Manager at Intel. I lead the open ecosystem team at Intel here. You can learn all about us at open.intel.com or what catch us in a wonderful podcast, which is also linked from that main website. Today, I'm very excited. I used to be part of Amazon, and I'm very excited to see how the story has evolved over the years. It's the most common household names. Do you Would you like to learn about how Amazon and why do they care about open source? Why do they contribute to open source? How does it tie it back to their business? And I have the two most wonderful people here, Nitya and David. Hi, Nitya and David.
Hi, Arun. Thanks for having us.
Hey, Arun.
Absolutely. Today the topic is exactly about why Amazon cares about open source and what do they do in the open source world. So maybe let's start with introductions.
Sure. So my name's David Nally. I run a team focused on open source strategy and marketing at AWS. And my focus is pretty narrowly scoped to the AWS business at Amazon.
Hey, Arun. I'm Nitya Ruff, and I run another team at Amazon called the Open Source Program Office. And we sit in the Amazon Software Builder Experience organization. And we serve all of Amazon's builders. So think AWS, think stores, devices, Prime, MGM, Whole Foods, etc. So it's a fun job kind of spanning the breadth, if you will, of Amazon.
That's wonderful. When I think about MGM, Whole Foods, .com, AWS, such a wide set of businesses, and we'll get into that. But let's talk about the basic fundamental question. Why does Amazon care about open source?
Well, I don't think there's just one answer to that. Uh, I think there's a number of reasons, and you called out there's a wide range of businesses, right? So that reason varies a little bit. But let me talk about AWS for a second. So first, and I think this holds true for large swaths of Amazon as well. Uh, AWS and also Amazon would not exist today without open source. When S3 was launched in 2006, um, it was built atop Apache Tomcat. When we launched EC2, that was built atop the Zen hypervisor. And so the very foundation, the fundamental elements of a lot of the technologies that enabled us to do things for our customers were open source. Uh, Next, our customers love open source, and they also demand open source. Open source for a lot of our customers is becoming something that they seek out, and they have a open source first mentality. And then finally, you know, you've seen the data, right? I know this is something not new to you, but we consume open source everywhere. It's ubiquitous, and so we have a little bit of a shared fate or a shared destiny, depending upon how pessimistic you are, with open source.
Beautiful. So what I'm hearing is AWS, particularly, which is the cloud element of Amazon. Foundation is OSS, all the way back from S3 to any modern service as you're thinking about it. The customers demand open source, and it's a shared destiny. And the way I think about this is, and tell me if it's accurate or not, I think AWS kind of makes open source sustainable. Nobody's going to download Kubernetes repo from GitHub and say, hey, I'm going to make this now run as a cluster, or nobody's going to download MySQL from their GitHub org and run it. By providing those services and taking care of those operational elements of it, it actually makes open source more sustainable. Is that a fair, accurate statement?
So I'm careful by saying all of open source is more sustainable, right? I don't want to take responsibility for all of open source. What I do think that AWS does, particularly when it provides services, is that it makes it easier for people to consume open source, which increases the user base of open source, which hopefully promotes sustainability of those underlying open source communities. That can't be the only thing, right? It can't just be users, but I think it's a key part of open source sustainability is getting folks to the point where they care about that.
Wonderful. Nitya, now let's pivot a little bit. Talk about MGM, Whole Foods, .com, all these different businesses. Why does it matter?
And it's the same story. All of these businesses, if you look back, was one of the first big e-commerce platforms, and we kind of set the stage for making it dead easy for customers to choose from a wide variety of components and things to buy, both third party as well as Amazon. And it was all about cost and clarity, right, of use and ease of use. And all of this was really built on open source infrastructure and components. And so also devices. If you look at devices, you have embedded open source projects like Yocto, which are very, very popular. And then in streaming, we are members of the Academy Software Foundation. And then if you look at Prime Music and all of our businesses, they're built on open source. But unlike AWS, in the case of our consumer businesses, customers really don't care what's underneath the device or product. They want choice, they want cost, they want ease of use. But we work in a supply chain in that business, right? So in that case, the supply chain cares about open source, and they want us to be able to work smoothly across using common components, common build systems, etc. And what's really exciting, Arun, is my team and I get involved in mergers and acquisition and doing due diligence. So from the point of due diligence, when we bring a business into Amazon, we make sure the open source story is good, and then we help them onboard to our open source policies and processes. And so these businesses become, open source businesses, basically.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Nitya, one of the things that one of the folks from your team called out to me recently was the retail side made the announcement, and I think this was in 2002 or 2003, but predates AWS. They made the announcement that Amazon.com, the retail site, was going to run on Linux. And that was such big news at the time. I mean, we take that for granted, right? All kinds of workloads run on Linux today. But that was in the Wall Street Journal. And it was seen as this, this large, and Amazon.com was already a large e-commerce retailer at the time, but it made the Wall Street Journal that Amazon was adopting Linux. And
That's right.
It's shocking to me that that would have been newsworthy, but apparently it was back then.
That's exactly right, David. I think it was the Kindle. The early versions of Kindle were, running on Linux. It's incredible. Frankly, a lot of new ground was broken by the stores, devices, and other businesses in terms of using open source and making contributions there.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Nitya, in your answer, you mentioned a few things over there. One is you talked about the Academy Software Foundation, and there are many other foundations that Amazon is part of. Why does Amazon care about joining these open source foundations?
A couple of reasons. One can easily contribute to a project without joining a foundation, right? So we do that sort of contribution too. But what puts us into joining a foundation is to really enable leadership in that space and make sure that that particular ecosystem is thriving and successful and moving forward in the right direction. It is to also contribute towards sustain area, right? Because we contribute money and we contribute time from a governance perspective. but also in terms of development. So those are two main reasons I would say we join a foundation versus just do developer contributions. David, any other points from the AWS side?
Yeah, so first of all, there are a lot of foundations. And while Amazon is a member of quite a number of foundations, we're not members of every foundation. And so we realize that that we have to make investments in various parts of open source. And so we're trying to make decisions about investing in foundations where we think we can have a material impact and improve that landscape. So we're members of CNCF because we think that cloud native technologies are really important to our customers and to us, and we want to make investments there. And we've made investments not just from being a member and not just from contributing code, but we're working on things like security processes and infrastructure as well. And so the big thing that we look at when we're trying to evaluate whether or not to join a foundation is what's the impact that we can have? Are we by our presence and by our investments in a number of places going to make that foundation more sustainable and drive better outcomes for the open source ecosystem?
I think that's the more, as you said, sustainable way, because joining a foundation that, yeah, we should join it because this is the latest hoop or latest hype, is not going to help you. You really need to tie it back to your business fundamentals.
Yeah.
Arun, that's exactly right. In fact, my team makes sure to guide teams when they're joining foundations to really answer the question, how is this your business outcomes and objectives? And they actually write a doc to show that they will continue to invest. They were not going to just come in for a year and leave, because you do need to sustain it. And who's going to participate at the development level, who's going to participate at the governing board level, so that this is taken seriously. You, like you said, you just don't do it to get a logo on a page and then leave. We want to make sure that people are taking it seriously.
Well, I remember when I joined Amazon, gosh, back in 2017, the first question I asked is, hey, why are we not part of CNCF? So I remember writing that 6-pager that let's write the CNCF PR FAQ. Like, we should join CNCF, but then it was a full-blown drill. What is the customer impact? Who's going to join? It needs to be somebody's day job. It cannot be as a side fringe that we have joined the foundation, paid the money, and we are out of it. So I think you're absolutely right. David, you were trying to say something.
Yeah, I think, and so Amazon clearly has a document culture, but a lot of the docs that people bring to Nithya and I, they say, oh, we think this is going to take 2 or 3 hours, and 2 or 3 hours a month. And Arun, you and I were talking earlier, you start wearing 1 or 2 hats, and suddenly, half your job is now working on some of those open source governance activities or open source infrastructure activities, ignoring the fact that somebody also has to be developing code. And so that's actually a red flag among us, where we want folks to realize that this is not 2 to 3 hours a month. This is probably 10, 20, 30 hours a week. And folks who don't realize that sets off warning flags for us that they don't have realistic ideas about engaging with an open source foundation.
Correct. Well, and you said it rightly that, yes, initially you write the doc, you join the foundation. Maybe you start with, this particular working group really matters to us. But as you start expanding your footprint within the foundation, you start realizing, oh, there are other elements. And then you bring it back in, and then you are coordinating inside your company. Like, you got to kind of create that two-way bridge, and pretty much, very soon, very quickly, it becomes a full-time job. And I remember, gosh, last year when I joined OpenSSF as a governing board member, who knew that and all of a sudden you are pulled into a chair position and it's like, oh, I need help. I can't be running a chair and not get help. Unfortunate that Intel provides support for that, but any role in the foundation, if it's not meaningfully impacting your business, is going to get pulled away.
And I think many companies understand the role of being on a standards body, and they plan for it, they fund for it, they staff for it. And we need to think about open source foundation work as very similar, that it needs to be part of someone's job, and we need to staff for it and provide adequate time and support for this person to do it. And maybe even some training, navigating open source communities and foundations is very different bodies, and you need to have a lot of emotional IQ to not say the wrong thing or think of it as a way to standardize. It's more a way to collaborate, support each other.
Yeah, I also look, in addition to it being someone's job, I also look to make sure that they have goals, and whether those are OKRs or KPIs or whatever the metric is, that they've got a metric for success, so that it's not just throwing time out there. What are the business goals that you're trying to achieve? Because if the business doesn't care, that funding and that time is likely to be cold pretty quickly.
Right, because it needs to be tied back to your incentive mechanism, right? So
Yeah.
Unless it is tied back to your OKR that you are being measured on, it's going to stay a fringe job. Like, oh, I'm not measured on. I'm going to do it as a hobby when I have time, and you never have time.
Exactly.
So, David, maybe pivot a little bit. You play another role. We all wear multiple hats. You have been the lead of Apache Software Foundation as well. How is that? Tell me about being the lead for AWS product marketing and the lead of the Apache Software Foundation. How are the two roles complementing each other? How does that work?
So obviously AWS cares a lot about the health and viability of the Apache Software Foundation. We have hard dependencies on a number of Apache Software Foundation projects. But really, in some ways, I try and pretend like they're completely separate. And, today I will go wear my Apache uniform, and tomorrow I will go wear my Amazon uniform. But there is this shared destiny that I was talking about earlier. And so Amazon has made time available for me, and they consider that. It was a factor in my hiring. It continues to be a factor in how we're assessed, because they're looking at they see that as a place where I can help improve the overall sustainability of an ecosystem that we have a dependency on. And so it is very much a dependency relationship, where we recognize that the Apache Software Foundation is a provider of tremendous value to us as a company. And so, and it's not just me, right? So there are other folks at Amazon who are members of the boards of directors, who are PMC chairs, and this is a single foundation. We've got other examples where Nithya is the chair of the board of directors for the Linux Foundation. And so Amazon has recognized for a number of years that it is worth our time to make investments, including of executives, to make investments in making sure that these open source public good entities are sustainable over the long haul.
So let me ask a bit provocative question here. I was at Amazon, so I know why Amazon contributes and how much it contributes and how much it cares about the sustainability of open source, why do you think Amazon does not get the credit?
So uh, one of these is a more general problem, right? So in open source for years, we have talked about the free rider problem, and there is no one in the world who contributes equal to the value that they get from open source. And so, in many ways, we're all deficient, but also Amazon has been incredibly successful in a number of different areas, and I think that occasionally casts a light on, imagine what Amazon could do. And so, we're focused on, when we're looking at taking a dependency on an open source project, folks are typically going to Nithya's team and saying, this is something we think is going to be crucial to our business going forward. Nithya's team's got a process whereby they report on a quarterly basis, and they report to their business team and Nithya and my team about the overall health of that project. And they're looking at what do we need to do to make sure that it's sustainable. And I think there is a fine balance there between doing everything you can and doing what is sustainable and will drive the business outcomes that we're looking for. And one of the things that really struck me is, in the recent macroeconomic situation, how much that impacted open source across the industry. And so I think there has to be that lens on sustainability inside the company as well. How do you ensure that the things that you're making investments in today are going to survive some of those downturns?
To add to what David said, I think it's really helped over the years for us to be more visible. Amazon is a very customer-driven company, and so when customers have challenges, we go all in to solve those problems. And so sometimes that distracts from being visible in the open source community, perhaps, and we are focused on, business outcomes and challenges. So David's team has done a really good job. And Arun, you were part of that organization. I think in 2017, with the formation of open source strategy and marketing, we really acknowledge that we need to also be visible in communities dependent upon. And so that has helped a great deal. And what David talked about, which is bringing it to the forefront of business leaders, the general managers of services, the product managers, that this is a part of your business. You do need to look at your open source dependencies and how they play a role in sustaining your business, serving your customers, being competent in the technology that your customers care about.
I think
And
there's
then,
also been, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think there's also been an evolution. We talked about launching of EC2 and S3. We talked about the fact that Amazon adopted Linux, showing up in the Wall Street Journal and being newsworthy. But there's been an evolution inside Amazon. There were the days where you could not acknowledge that you worked for Amazon if you were going to participate in open source. And so you had to do that from your personal email address. You couldn't use your work email address. And those policies have changed over the years, but I think we're still living with some of that debt that we essentially accrued from not letting people say that they worked for Amazon or what they were working on.
Well, that cultural change is massive, actually. So, and after Amazon, I ended up working at Apple, and that culture is fierce over there. I ended up building their first open source program office, and to date, people can go whatever they want to do, but there are very tight control restrictions in terms of it. Yeah, I work for a company and I contribute to open source. I can name the company, and that debt, that baggage, I can completely understand goes a long way. People memories get stuck like several years ago. It's like, oh, that has changed. I was living under a stone. I didn't realize it. So that makes sense.
And I think you bring up a really good point, which is um, policies have to change across the company, processes needs the company. And from 2007 to the OSPO of today, we've made it dead simple to consume open source, to contribute to open source, to distribute, to release, and the policies have reduced a lot of the friction. And so that makes it also much easier to go do what they need to do in their communities.
Yeah. It used to be, and this is true in a lot of companies, but it used to be that every open source contribution had to get approvals. Nitya's team has done an incredible job of working with the legal department and a number of other stakeholders to drive that friction down to the point that the majority of open source contributions need no pre-approval today. So people are empowered in most parts of Amazon businesses to just go get things done in open source. And that has also been a huge shift in people quickly get discouraged if they have to go ask people for permission to solve a problem. And so removing some of those approval steps, I think has been transformative in how AWS and how Amazon deals with open source, especially some of our upstreams.
So how do you ensure like people like how do you enable people? How do you empower people? I understand from the process perspective you have made those changes, but what if something bad happens? How do you kind of reconcile that?
I think David's team and my team, we are all about being proactive and preventing dumpster fires from happening by working as far proactively and upstream with the businesses as we can, and to catch things as quickly as we can. And I'm really encouraged I've just been with Amazon for the last year and a half, but I think David can attest to this more. We are pulled into strategic conversations more and more earlier. So we are able to provide our guidance earlier so that we don't end up making these mistakes. When they do happen, I mean, David's team is fabulous at jumping in and resolving, challenges. And on Thursdays, every week of every month, a month, on Thursdays, we all meet together, all of the different open source leaders across the company. So we have the businesses sometimes, but we have legal, we have David's team, my team, and distinguished engineers who are guiders. What we do, provide sponsorship. We discuss critical issues that are coming up across the businesses. Most of the time we are trying to proactively, prevent this from happening. But back to you, David.
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, first of all, mistakes are going to happen, problems are going to happen. We're humans,
Exactly.
and we work in a company full of humans,
Yes.
and so for the majority of things, they're not catastrophic problems, and so some of that is you have to trust people that they are generally going to act in the best interest of the open source ecosystem. Secondly, though, to the degree that there are unintentional problems, unforced errors, some of that you can do with erecting some guardrails. So, for instance, I talked about the fact that most people can make contributions without any approval. That's not true across the board, right? Here's the list of projects, or here's a list of licenses that projects may use that are pre-approved. You don't have to ask approval. And so getting the things that may be more problematic into a place where people say, huh, this isn't pre-approved, maybe I should be looking. Both Nithya and my team, though, have also been creating a lot of training. Nithya's team runs an open source practice session that they run with engineers on a regular basis to talk about things like community norms and where are the danger areas in various parts of open source. And Amazon, having such a large engineering organization, has its own internal engineering conferences, which a lot of training exists there around open source. And you'd perhaps be surprised, but there was such demand this year for that open source content that they created a dedicated virtual event that I think largely Nithya's team drove and produced because folks could not get enough of the open source content at the in-person event.
That's wonderful. David, some of the points you mentioned is, I think that is the fundamental way to think about is failure is inevitable. It is going to happen. How do we embrace it is really the fundamental way to think about it. And I remember seeing Werner Vogel's keynote at one of the reInvents where he talked about that element, that every cable, every network, every disk is bound to fail. So how do you account for that as opposed to hoping that it's not going to fail? It is going to fail. So I think that's sort of the same philosophy I'm seeing coming down over here. The other part you mentioned is trust in people, that they are acting in their best interest, that there are no malicious actors. If it happens, then we deal with it. And then the third point that you mentioned is sort of setting up the guardrails, because then you're giving that, okay, if you're looking at a non-OSI approved license, talk to us. And that's sort of the important element over here.
Yeah. I to channel my inner Werner, everything fails all the time. And if you're setting a system up where a failure is a catastrophic thing, you're going to be disappointed because it's going to be catastrophic all the time. You have to assume there's going to be failures.
And on the guardrails, set them up such that they're part of the work process and work streams there's participate in, so that it guides them to do the right thing, right? And make it seamless and frictionless. And that's been a big mantra for the Open Source Program Office, is not to have to open a ticket, not to delay a developer in asking questions, just guide them in the right path automatically.
Wonderful. Now let's pivot a little bit. Amazon contributes to a lot of open source projects. How do you measure success of those contributions?
So, in many ways, that depends on what the strategy is for that particular project, and that varies all the time. And I think it even varies down to the type of the contribution. Some of the things that we're doing are focused on security, and we're trying to reduce attack surface, or we're trying to harden an attack surface, and we're looking at the efficacy of those efforts. Sometimes we're looking at adding new features. Sometimes we're just shipping the software because we're acting as a release manager. And so I think it really depends. I don't think there's a single measure that you could say this is universally the one KPI. We're not looking at lines of code or even percentage of contributions accepted as a goal for success. We're looking at, are we accomplishing the business goals? And I hate the open source purist inside me dislikes saying, tying everything back to the business, but the business is what's funding people to work on those open source projects. And so we're looking at, are we accomplishing the business goals we had?
Yeah, the virtuous cycle that Linux Foundation talks about, which is projects that then become used to create products and services, which then create value and money, which then gets reinvested back in. That is an important virtuous cycle. If projects are not being consumed and used by businesses, sometimes it's hard to make the right investment. And that alignment between project and business goals is so critical to convincing the business leader to say, yes, this investment is worth it, because if the project is successful, my product will be successful. So I think we have done a better job over the past few years of tying business goals, business continuity success to the project success, and that's allowed us to make the right contributions, the right investments in various areas. And then there is some level of investment that is towards lifting the entire open source, ecosystem. It's what SSF. It's what we do with Alpha Omega. So how can we make the entire upstream healthier and have better open source practices? And then we do a lot of sharing of best practices at conferences, at events. And that is, again, to say, hey, we've looked inside the company and we think that maybe it'll benefit others. So we participate in things like the To-Do group and certainly other projects. And frankly, the governance work that David does and I do, it is to basically give back and make sure that we are making healthier governance and healthier ecosystems across open source. What you're doing, Arun, that's a lot of heavy lifting, leading the open SSF and leading CNCF. Really benefits from business maturity and leadership maturity that we all hopefully bring to the table.
Yeah, I will add one thing to that, Nithya, and that is, you talked about things we're doing that hopefully improve things across the board. I see that as the really long-term focus on improving the state of things for our customers and ourselves. But it's much like Amazon sustainability efforts around climate change. We're looking out long term because we realize that if we're not making those long-term sustainable investments in open source, that there are more dire consequences to come. We need a robust open source ecosystem. And I don't just mean Amazon. Amazon and our customers need a robust open source ecosystem to drive innovation, to reduce the cost of innovation, and to drive down the time to value in software development.
Exactly right. I was just going to state, not like a renter, right? Because
Yes.
owners think long term. Owners say, I'll fix it, and not just delegate it to somebody else.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of thinking about it. Talk to me a little bit about what is the philosophy around chop wood, carry water kind of work. Code contributions is one part of it, but code is king, no questions about it. But what keeps these open source communities thrive and sustain is chop wood, carry water work. What is the philosophy of Amazon doing that kind of work? And is that valued? Is that rewarded? Or is that like, not really customer focused, so not going to do this? So what's the theory behind that?
To be honest, we are more and more valuing that work through hiring maintainers of key projects that are 100% dedicated towards maintaining that project, which includes all unglamorous parts of maintenance. And we particularly have written a document inside the company to help others understand the role of a maintainer and why we need to support that role and why we need to enable that role to succeed. And this document is both aimed at managers of maintainers, but also people, human resources, and business owners, so that we can continue to support people who are doing this tremendous task of running open source projects. It's, or whether it's Containerd or Kubernetes or other projects, we're more and more investing in people like that who we feel are the backbones of some of these open source projects.
Yeah. Inside Amazon, I tend to talk about, instead of chop wood, carry water, I talk about it as electricity and plumbing. Because Amazon maintains a lot of data centers, a lot of fulfillment centers. We understand that investing in those types of things yields real value. And so when you understand that it's not just, hey, this person is over there and they're not producing lines of code, they're doing work that is involved in either governance or the maintenance activities required to ship a release or something of that nature. When you put it into that context, it's much more easily understood, and it's less, this person over here, I can't figure out how to value them.
And it's such an important element, Arun, of teaching businesses how to value open source value and impact, because most of our role guidelines, most of our performance appraisals and promotions are to value work done inside the company, very traditional software development work, right? Or maybe feature work. And so we've worked really hard with our HR partners to say, this is the way you map impact in open source to impact any. And that's helped us a lot in valuing someone becoming an Apache member, someone helping move a project forward in the right direction, or playing the role in a governance way.
So let me dig a little bit deeper on that. If you hire somebody who's a 100% maintainer, they may not be bringing direct business value, but definitely indirect business value, but some business value. But they will be doing a lot of work that is reviewing PRs, reviewing patches, making sure the builds go smoothly, mentoring. That may not be directly related to business. How would they be like? How would they rate against an engineer who is actually building products for Amazon and taking it forward? Are they ranked? Are they rated kind of in a similar graph?
Can I challenge your premise? So we don't hire maintainers for maintainer roles unless there is business value to be taken out. Now, we do have a number of folks who are in maintainer roles that's orthogonal to their job. But if we are going out of our way to go hire an open source maintainer to do that type of work, the justification and the business value is already well established. And I've been a part, certainly as hiring has slowed in some companies. I've been a part of a number of those justifications of why do we need to open headcount for this specific thing. And let me tell you, those business owners, they understand the value of having an open source maintainer in their business.
Right. And I think it's very important that the hiring manager and their manager up the chain kind of understand the relevance and the importance of it. Because what would be really bad is if we hire these maintainers and then they feel burnt out because they're not getting growth opportunities inside the company.
Yes. Yes. But your question was, how do they measure relative to the folks who are doing internally facing work? And a year, maybe 2 years ago now, folks on Nithya's team recognized that there was a gap there. That we have a very limited number of roles inside Amazon, and so the role guidelines probably apply to 15,000, 20,000 people for each one of those particular roles. And so because those roles are so broad, how do you ensure that open source work is captured and reflected so that you can have equitable performance reviews, so that you can have equitable promotions? And they basically dove deep into the role guidelines. So we've got a doc that describes, here are the responsibilities, here are the expected outcomes for each level of software developer, for instance. And they map those activities to specific things that happen in open source, so that folks were able to quickly see how those activities mirrored what folks should be evaluated on. Now, I do think it's a little more difficult because you're doing work outside of the company. And so all of the systems that are designed to track efficiency and things like that, nobody's going to allow you to go plug all of those into a Git repo. So there's certainly some work required on the manager of those maintainers to be able to capture the data and the effects. But we've done a good job, I think, of communicating the right questions to be asking for those managers. And there's one of Nithia's directs runs a program targeted at managers of maintainers to help them through that process, especially when it's a manager who might be new to open source.
Yeah. And in fact, HR came to us this year and wanted to use their MBA intern to work on this problem of how do we value and recognize open source talent in the company. And she worked through the summer on a fantastic action plan and the gaps that she saw in, all the different personas in open source, right? The maintainer, the casual contributor, person who sits in a governance function, like David and I. So she came up with some really good recommendations, and so HR and the OSPO and Awesome teams will partner with HR to implement these so that we, as a company across the board, know how to value and retain and develop this wonderful talent inside the company in the context of a very, very large company that needs to be able to implement these things across the entire company.
Yeah, because I think David and both of you were talking about it. When I'm doing a annual review of an employee who's all internal facing work, then I know the impact that they're creating. I can go talk to my peers or managers. I can look at through the org directory and I can reach out to them and I can get deeper validation. But when the work is heavily done in the open source, and if I'm a new manager to open source, I don't know who to reach out to. I don't know who to get validation from. And I don't know, are they my peer? Is that a valid feedback coming in? Is that some random person in the open source community? So like if the work is happening in Kubernetes, then somebody who's a SIG lead versus Tim Hawkin giving the feedback is one heck of a difference. So I think in that element, that education is a fundamental and a critical part of it.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I wish it was simpler. I'm not sure that we, especially for maintainers, even for developers on open source projects, if all you're doing is committing code, fixing bugs, and submitting new features, that's much easier to manage than, hey, this guy is setting the direction. Or, I think a lot. So Amazon has one of the 5 maintainers of Redis, and I had lots of assumptions about how much work Madeline Olson, who's that maintainer, was doing in Redis. And I went looking, and it's not tens of thousands of lines of code every month. Madeline's going in and saying, I'm not sure this is right from an architectural perspective. And the simple act of saying no or redirecting is a lot more valuable than a few thousand lines of code. And we have a process for figuring out how people do that inside companies. Measuring it in some of those external communities takes a lot more nuance.
It totally does. And it's not an easy problem to solve, as you said correctly, but really working with these maintainers and understanding, guide me. Like, yes, I understand the generic role of maintainer, but guide me. What are the things that you exactly did? Because I'm not involved in your day-to-day life. So guide me so that I can help build a better case for your promo or whatever your next grade is going to be. That way is fundamental.
And I think the open source program office and the strategy and marketing teams can really play a big role in helping managers interpret these artifacts from open source and the activity source. So we are often consulted, for example, when they're hiring to build the right hiring loop, if you will, for bringing in an open source developer, or in the promo process itself. And so I think we can help a lot in saying significant. If someone becomes a member of Apache, that's significant because that recognizes years and years of building trust and contributing to a project and actually doing, impactful work. So we often get pulled in to these types of promos or hiring and development.
Yeah. I mean, there was a recent there's a person at Intel who is one of the top contributors to Kubernetes, and I was pulled in exactly for the same reason that okay, why is this relevant? And then qualifying it, and more importantly, quantifying it. That on the HR scale, when you are looking at it, here is your grade 7, grade 8, grade 9 expectations. This person is clearly operating at this grade. And let me tell you why in the open source context. I think that's the kind of discussion that we get pulled in all the time. But having a more measurable, quantifiable scale, because right now it's still a nuanced discussion and telling them, and I think it's fair because initially we have to do those nuanced discussions, and then once we have done it a few times, then we can say, okay, now we understand the framework. Let's lay it out. Beautiful. Wow, 50 minutes have passed by. David, you also have AWS or other open source at AWS website. So let me bring that up here.
Yeah. So this is the AWS open source website, and it's some of it's just saying we do open source at Amazon, but we also are featuring a number of our open source projects, and this rotates from time to time. But we're talking about things like OpenSearch or the AWS distribution for OpenTelemetry, FreeRTOS, which is a real-time operating system for IoT devices. And while we're involved in a lot of open source projects, this is trying to showcase just a few of the things that we're showcasing. One of the things I wish was up here was Cedar, which is a new formally verified authorization layer. Or you can think of it as like a policy application. So administering policy at scale and making sure it's correct and that people have authorization to do specific things. And so again, this kind of rotates through a number of different projects, but this has a few that it's trying to showcase.
And there used to be like a regular blog as well, which gets pushed out. So how can people get access to that?
Yeah. So if you search any search engine for the AWS open source blog, it will certainly show up on as that first result. And there's content going out there on a regular basis that you can go take a look at.
Sounds wonderful. This has been, let me actually hide this screen away. This has been a fantastic conversation. When I started, I wasn't sure how long we're going to go, but we have almost consumed a full hour. Anything that I should have asked and I didn't ask that you want to share?
The devices and stores teams also have contributions that they've made. And I want to highlight Dent, which is a project at the open source, the Linux Foundation. in the area of these unmanned stores where shelves have sensors that are able to detect, consumption, and so there's lots of advances in e-commerce and transportation, etc. and bots, etc. that are things that the store side and the devices side have actively worked in and contributed to. And they continue to do more and more work in that space. And to David's point earlier, diversity of businesses, we work individually with each business to make sure that the open source strategy fits into their business. And that's what makes being at Amazon for me as an open source leader so exciting, because I get to see a fantastic array of projects and businesses and work with some of the most smart people, Arun, as you know, in the world.
Yeah, I want to call out another weird, I say weird, something I didn't think of and that I was surprised to learn, even though I'd been at AWS for a while and learned it. It's that the last mile folks in Amazon are huge contributors to OpenStreetMap. And, it boggles my mind the size of the contributions that they're making and the number of people working on it. And, I tend to spend a lot of time looking at the AWS business, but that's a part of Amazon that I hadn't considered making a lot of open source contributions, and yet they're doing that every single day.
Honestly, the way I see this is, go back to Microsoft 10, 15 years ago when it was said open source is a cancer. Amazon never made that strong a statement ever. But Microsoft has been going through this cultural transformation. And now, Microsoft and Synonymous kind of go hand in hand very well. So I see really Amazon going through that cultural transformation over the last several years. I certainly was part of it, and you folks are really carrying the flag really well. So that's sort of the transformational journey. This could take 5 to 7 to 8 years by the time people actually start recognizing it. That's sort of how I see it.
I mean, perception does tend to lag reality by quite a bit, right? And so that is not to say that we don't have a lot of work in front of us. Nithya and I were talking earlier this week just about some of the massive opportunities that are sitting in front of us for problems that we haven't solved yet. So
that's the beauty of open source world. Absolutely, can't deny it. And I'm sure it's not just your problem; it's an industry problem. So we will be collaborating on those problems together.
Yes, we will.
Fantastic. Well, folks, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully others learned a lot from it too as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Arun. Appreciate it.
Thank you for questions and opportunity to showcase this. Take care.
Of course, I'm going to end the stream now. Take care.